So we're here this afternoon as part of J Arts Boston's Kitchen Exploration Series. I'm Chef Michael Leviton, and a couple of years ago, J Arts approached me with and the Food Think Tank about ways to tell Jewish stories within the context of food. And we brought in some partners at the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center and the Vilna Shul, and took a look at this really fascinating recipe archive, and went back about 100 years and looked at all of these recipes. And I found a few that I thought were both interesting to me and might actually also be somewhat interesting to some other folks out there, and took upon this idea of revisiting these recipes in a more modern context. And that really got us going in terms of how we wanted to look at the stories of folks in and around Boston and the relationship between Jewish food and all of these myriad different cultures. And so today we're here to talk with Marcia Weiss, who originally from Brooklyn. And given that originally from Brooklyn, we might think, as in the case of my parents, Ashkenazi. Well, no, actually, we're going to go a slightly different direction today, and we're going to go Sephardic. Marcia, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to speak with you about this. Can you tell me a little bit about the recipe we're going to be doing today, and sort of where it come from, and some memories around it?
Okay, so we're going to be cooking, or you're going to be cooking, I guess, mina, which is a Passover food that Sephardic Jews from Turkey, I guess, because my grandparents are from Turkey, so I really can't say what they cooked in Greece, but I would assume that it's similar. And it is essentially a boyo, which is kind of like a Sephardic knish, but it's done with matzah. It's not done with leavened bread. It's done with matzah, and the filling actually sits on different levels of matzah. And that's something that we used to have at Passover, and you can make many different versions of it. You can do it with spinach inside. I'm sure that there are many versions you can do, but our family did it with spinach inside, with cheese inside, and with meat inside. So when my daughter Eliza submitted this Sephardic recipe, she submitted mina, and I was actually a little puzzled because I don't really call it mina. I call it minika, although I knew what she was talking about. So then the question arose as to what's the difference between minika and mina. And I kind of thought about it, and to me, they're actually the same thing. But what I was starting to think is that mina is the knish, it's the knish-like food that is served for Passover because it's made with matzah. But minika is probably an affectionate term for it because it has the diminutive ICA at the end. So instead of my mother calling it, or my grandmother calling it mina, she called it minika. And in fact, my grandmother used to put that diminutive term on all of our last names. I was Machika, my cousin Arthur was Tico. It's interesting that one of my cousins said she never heard her mother refer to it as anything but minika. But my grandmother, that was the mother of all 4 daughters, including this cousin's mother, referred to it as minika to me. So I don't think size has any difference here, but some people might disagree with me. Who knows?
And do you have any recollection of actually watching your grandmother prepare this? I mean, I'm sure you remember eating it, but
Yes.
I'm curious about the preparation, and perhaps specifically around the Minikas de Espinaca, which is the one that I'm going to demo a little later.
Right. She would very painstakingly get spinach, and she wouldn't use frozen spinach, which they didn't really have in those days. All of her daughters graduated using frozen spinach, and would pick all of the impurities out of it. She would roll the dough with a rolling pin, and she would set that out on the table. And she had the big table, and there were different parts of this food that were in different parts of the table. So one part would have her dough, which she always sprinkled with, I don't know what, with some baking soda, I guess. And then one side would have all the spinach laid out in one row. It was kind of in one row. And then she would put a paper cloth on the spinach and on the dough, and she would put it in the refrigerator overnight. And then the next day she would put the spinach into the either the dough or the matzo, depending upon if it was Passover or not.
Again, very simple. Cook some spinach, or even don't cook some spinach. Get some frozen spinach. Mix it with some eggs and some cheese. Soak some matzah and basically fill a pan. Right? Not too difficult. It can really be that simple, or you can chefify it a little bit, which is I couldn't help myself, so I kind of did that. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is move over here. And my preferred method for cooking this spinach is going to be to take about a cup of water. So now we are going to move on over to the stove and actually cook off, cook the spinach. So I've got my burner nice and hot, a decent sized pot with some hot water in it, and really you don't need very much, just enough to get the spinach going. Spinach being mostly water will release a lot of that into the pan and cause it to steam as well. So I just want to move this around a little bit, bringing the cooked stuff up to the top. That kind of helps to weight down the rest of it, get it to cook a little more evenly, and then out we go. And while that is cooling and draining, we will go back over to the cutting board and get everything else set for our next and final steps in the process.
I don't think I met a person that wasn't Jewish until maybe I was 17 or 18 years old. That's how densely and uniformly Jewish it was.
My parents and all of their families also grew up in Brooklyn, but everyone's Ashkenazi. And so I'm curious about your Sephardic heritage and about what it was like to grow up in perhaps an environment where that was somewhat viewed as different, or was the neighborhood all Sephardic?
Because of food, and because my mother was the one that cooked, and we never really cooked anything but Sephardic food in our house if we were going to honor our Jewish traditions. I mean, everything was very Mediterranean and tomato sauce. And so because my mother and my grandmother and all of my aunts cooked a lot, and our food was not only came through our mothers, but food was really one of the main things that distinguished Sephardics from Ashkenazi people, because our food was very different. When my Sephardic grandmother made stuffed cabbage, hers wasn't sweet and sour. When she made harosis for Passover, hers consisted of dates and crushed nuts. Whereas when I went to my father's family, theirs was, I guess, apples and wine. I mean, everything in our eating habits was much more geared to Sephardicness. I mean, we ate a lot of dried fruits. We ate nuts. So in that sense, I knew that that set us apart, but it was in no way made us feel like we were outsiders in the neighborhood at all.
So now we move on to the fun step of soaking the matzah. And the first thing I'm actually going to do is to lay out a couple of clean towels. So the recipe calls, I think, for 4 to 6 matzos. I'm going to err on the heavy side, so I'm going to go for the full 6. Maybe actually even a 7th just to be safe. So we're going to soak this for about 2 minutes. A little less, I think, is safe. At 2 minutes or definitely beyond, the matzah does start to break down and get more than a little cottony. And I found it somewhat helpful to keep separating the layers of the matzah in here, just to get some, adequate water flow between the layers. All right, so now that it's been about 2 minutes or so, I'm going to kind of carefully, because I don't want this matzah to fall apart on me, transfer it over to the towel. And those are just going to relax and even out for about the next 15 minutes or so. So we've got some next steps now in terms of getting ready to, we're going to beat some eggs, mix our cheese in, chop and squeeze the spinach, and make sure we season it well.
Cultural richness, I think, is the way that I really looked at it. I didn't look at it as a positive or a negative thing, but my culture was a little bit different than the culture of all the other Jewish people in my neighborhood, which was basically 100% of everyone was Jewish. I actually was trying to figure out if mina was a Spanish word, was it a Ladino word, or was it a Turkish word, because my grandmother was from Turkey and she peppered her language with Turkish also. I don't remember how old we were, but I think I must have been in college when my mother and her sisters didn't want the recipes to be lost. And so they got each of us a Sephardic cookbook. And it was one of those bound spiral cookbooks that I think in those days a lot of companies were putting, what kind of, you could get your own cookbook. And in the cookbook were a lot of Sephardic recipes. And I had other Sephardic cookbooks, and these were totally different recipes. And these were much more authentic recipes. But the recipes were separated and categorized by the area where they were from. So a Sephardic Jew from Rhodes in Greece might not have the same recipe as a Sephardic Jew from a certain location in Turkey.
First thing while we're waiting is that we are going to just very lightly grease the pan. A little shot of olive oil. We're going to set this aside for a moment. So we're going to take 1 egg, a generous pinch of salt, some freshly ground pepper, and the recipe calls for cheese, and it gives you a number of different alternatives. The first couple of iterations I went with straight kashkaval, which was okay, a little mild for my taste. So what I've done now is to go 50-50 with kashkaval and some pecorino romano for a little more salty punch. So between the two, it's going to be a 1/4 cup. So 50-50 there. And now I'm just going to mix this all up. And you might be wondering, Michael, don't I have to finely grate the cheese? And I'm going to say that you could if you want to, but there's really no need because it will melt in with the spinach as it cooks. So set that aside for a second. Now we have our spinach here. And all I'm going to do is just gather it up, give it a nice little squeeze. And that gives us right about the quart that we need. So now I'm just going to chop this, and it doesn't need to be fancy. Just we want to get smaller pieces so that when you get a forkful of the finished product, it'll actually fit in your mouth. And there we go. I'm going to now mix this in with my egg and cheese. The egg and the cheese. And this is actually a good point to get both hands in there and really make sure it gets evenly mixed in. We're going to set that aside for a few minutes.
My grandmother's cooking, and I'm going to cry here, and I did it before, is a main part of my memory and my connection to my family, to my Sephardic family, because, and I don't know if it's because my Ashkenazi grandparents, my grandmother was not a good cook. My father used to say that you could take a matzo ball and you could, throw it and kill someone with it. But it's not really a connection to my dad. Food is not really a connection to my dad's side of the family. I spent a lot of time with my dad's family because we lived near there, and we used to go to Passover Seders there of 40 people at a table. But food does not really connect me to them specifically, except for the fact that Jewish food basically connects me to, Judaism.
All right, so now that we've taken a second to clean up our board and get everything ready for the next steps, now what we're going to do is to take the matzah and line our baking dish, and then we'll be ready to fill and then top with a little more egg and a little more cheese, because everybody loves more egg and more cheese. So the easiest part, and you'll see these matzahs are a little difficult to work with. I'm going to be very careful. So I'm trying to get a nice even layer on the bottom, but also, and this is where some guesstimation comes in terms of how high up the sides we really want to go. This is why for the given amount, I like the 8-inch pan. This one's actually about 9 inches. So I'm not going to come up as high. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to guess that it's probably about 1.5 inches here. And kind of fill in like that. I'm just going to try and go all the way around at roughly 1.5 inches. And then we're also going to fill in the bottom, of course, as well. And since no one's going to see the bottom really, that's a good place for the scraps. The sides really are the difficult work. So now we're just going to kind of fill in a little more randomly. That looks pretty good. So now what I'm going to do is to take our spinach, egg, and cheese mix and just kind of put all of that in here. Try and even it out. Okay. Take the rest of our matzah, and now we're just going to try and sort of complete the puzzle, as it were. Isn't that cute?
My grandmother was the only one here. So it was she and her 4 daughters, I think you really had to know what she was like to understand that she was really in a foreign country all by herself. And she didn't have a lot to really give to her daughters in terms of material things, but she gave them food. And she passed all of that down to us. So the influence on me is it's very evocative and it connects me very, very much to my roots and very much so. But I do not cook. So my sisters have made these recipes, not in the way my cousin Madeline or my cousin Robbie does. I have never made a single one of these recipes, but my daughter Allison cooks that stuff. I mean, she'll cook it, and she's so happy to know how to cook it and to have the cookbook. I actually bought copies of the cookbook that I wasn't able to provide for for both of my daughters. So it was important enough to me to go back and get that cookbook.
Now we're back, move that over there. A couple of more eggs now. And the second part calls for roughly a half a cup of cheese. So equal parts again, Castrovallo and Pecorino. Tiny bit of salt. And we mix. Oops. All right, and now, very easy, we're just going to kind of gently pour this on top and try and smooth that around so that we get pretty nice and even coverage. And aside from the obvious egg infused flavor, this is going to give us a really wonderful kind of golden brown topping. So, there we are, good to go. Just like that. Now we're going to put this in the oven, 350 degrees. I would set the timer for 50 minutes and come take a check at that point.
It's very important to me to keep the flame of Jewish culture alive. The older I get, it's very, 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 very important to me. But also to keep the flame of Sephardic culture alive, which is subsumed in the larger Jewish culture, because that is a culture that really not that many people know about, and particularly here in the U.S. And because I feel very special to be half Sephardic, I feel very special about it. I want my kids to feel special about that, and my grandchildren.
Right, and I wanted to ask also, you were talking about how one of your daughters will, cook these recipes now. Do you, when you eat that food, are you tasting what your grandmother cooked, or has it somehow changed and evolved, in the however many years since your grandmother was cooking it?
It doesn't taste all that different, frankly. The pre-done fila dough and the paper dough that my grandmother made, and the non-frozen spinach and the frozen spinach doesn't taste all that different. And maybe I don't really remember how great it tasted years ago, but it gives the same feeling of continuing the culture, and everything needs to adapt to modern times. And it's really great that they've adapted that to modern times, and they're handing it down to their children. I know that my cousin Madeline has a daughter, and I think that she cooks with her. She's handing it down to her. I'm doing my bit to hand it down. The older I get, the more important it is to just maintain my Judaism and be an advocate for it.
Okay, so now 50 minutes later, we've got something that hopefully looks a little like this. Nice golden brown topping. And you've got a couple of choices here. I'm told that traditionally you just cut out squares or whatever shape and serve as you'd like. There was a previous iteration where I actually managed to completely flip this out, which on the one hand looks really cool, on the other hand you no longer see the golden brown crust. What I'm going to do is just to cut into this, and we'll see how we've done. You can't smell it, but it smells really good. Okie dokie, there we go. And there we are. Right. So, as we were talking about, to me, this really does kind of look like spanakopita, right? And so we've got the nice layers of matzah. Top is obviously a little more dried out because that's been exposed to the air, where the bottom is going to be all nice and tender, where it's absorbed some of that spinach juice. And now, actually, let me take a taste because I'm really curious. Mm-hmm. Mm. That's really good. Sort of a cross between I don't know, matzo brine, spanakopita, and a bureka, all kind of rolled into one. Really delicious. I will say that the pecorino mix definitely helps a lot, and do not be shy about seasoning the spinach mixture ahead of time, because that's your one opportunity to really get the seasoning into the equation.
What's there? Is there an expression, you are what you eat, or am I just making it up? But a way that you can identify with being Jewish, or one of the ways, is certainly food, and certainly with Sephardic food, because a lot of people go to a deli and get a frank, but not that many people eat manika and eat mina and eat boyos and burekas and lots of other things. I think the older you get, at least for me, a sense of what your essence, what you really and truly are at your core. And my core, I really and truly am a Jew. I think food is one of the connecting factors, because really, what do people do a lot of, whether you're going out with your friends or you're sitting with your family? You break bread. That's how people socialize, and that's how people live. But I do think that when you have a culture that is not dominant, and you have very specific foods, particularly Sephardic foods that nobody really hears about, um, then that's a very special thing that you want to keep and you want to treasure and you want to hand down. And it's one part of your culture. I mean, there are many threads to your culture and many things you want to preserve. That's just one part of it, but it's a big part of it.
I'm really very grateful to Marcia, both for the time she spent with us and the stories she told us, as well as for this delicious recipe. Again, it's just a fantastic way for us to be able to connect with the stories of our great-grandparents, our grandparents, our parents, whatever, and to really more deeply connect with our Jewish culture and Jewish heritage. For many of us, myself especially, it's really very easy to do it through food. But this is really a terrific opportunity, and I love being able to sort of take a look at these things and to be able to understand sort of what someone was thinking when they were doing this, trying to in some way communicate the love that hopefully they were cooking with. And I hope that you will try this at home, and hope that it comes out really well for you as well.